is with us at the International Environment House. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the video of the event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a side event to the Regional Forum on Sustainable Development for the UN Economic Commission for Europe region. The forum is taking place today and tomorrow in Geneva and virtually. This side event, which will discuss microplastics pollution, was initially proposed by the University of Geneva and is co-organized with the Geneva Environment Network, Norway and Switzerland within the framework of the Geneva Plastic Pollution Dialogues. The Geneva Plastic Pollution Dialogues have kept the international community in Geneva and beyond engaged on this topic since the end of 2020, making links with the United Nations Environment Assembly and other international processes. And again today we are making these links. The dialogues, which third series is being launched with this event, are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, IUCN, Norway, Switzerland, and the Forum on Trade, Environment and Sustainable Development Goals, known as TESS. And our new partner is from today, the University of Geneva. I will have the pleasure to moderate this event and introduce the speakers when giving them the floor. Before we go into depth on the topic we are addressing today, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary as well as the video of the event will be made available on the webpage of this event. The link is being shared in the chat. Throughout the event, those who are online can raise their questions by using the Q&A box or making comments on social networks. We will use your questions to feed the discussion after the presentations, and we will of course give the floor to who is in the room. The aim of today's event is to provide an overview of the current global state of science and policy of marine pollution by microplastics and possible impacts on life below water. The event will discuss the nexus of science, policy and action to achieve Target 1 on reducing marine pollution of the Sustainable Development Goal 14 on life below water, one of the goals being reviewed by the forum this year. As you most certainly have noticed, microplastic pollution is making headlines in the media. In the past few weeks, articles in well-known media have been relaying that it's snowing microplastic in the ocean and that microplastics have been found in human blood for the first time. As we relaunch the dialogues, this topic seems timely. For the opening of this event, to provide us the international and political context of the event, how history was made some weeks ago, the relevance of various international processes in this context, and what we are trying to achieve, it is our pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Franz Perez, Switzerland's Ambassador for the Environment, who was leading Switzerland's delegation at the United Nations Environment Assembly last month, and whose team is also involved in the regional forum. Excellency, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and let me thank you so much and the University of Geneva and the GEN for organizing such a timely event at the margins of the Regional Forum on Sustainable Development currently taking place in Geneva. As you know, the Regional Forum Europe is a great opportunity for our region to contribute substantively to the high-level political forum on sustainable development, the HLPF, notably through an exchange of knowledge, good practices and solutions to support the implementation of Agenda 2030. This year, SDG 14, Life Below Water, is under in-depth review, and we trust that this event will also make useful contribution in that regard. Microplastics, as you just have indicated, are an important issue to address to reach Target 14.1, addressing marine pollution. A month ago, at UNIA 5.2, a highly important decision was taken in this regard. The international community agreed to launch negotiations on an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including the marine environment. This global treaty will certainly make a significant contribution to the implementations of the SDGs, and namely also SDG 14. Let me now first highlight some of the key points of the resolution that I believe are really important for our discussion. First, the recognition that we need to address plastic pollution in all the compartment of the environment. Focusing on marine pollution alone is not sufficient, as most plastic entering the oceans are from land-based sources. Second, the mandate is clear about the need to address the full life cycle of plastics. It means that there is broad understanding that to prevent and reduce plastic pollution, we need to adopt a comprehensive approach that not only focuses on downstream measures such as waste management and marine pollution, but also takes action upstreams. Indeed, as we are not and will not be able to future recycle all plastics, it is really important that we reduce plastic pollution as such. We need to find ways to reduce the amount of plastic entering the markets. We also need to build a safe and sustainable circular plastic economy, meaning that the most problematic plastics need to be phased out. Third, the resolution mentions explicitly that microplastics are part of plastic pollution. While this might seem obvious for some, it was not a given, and in fact, that is in front and center, it was not a given, and in fact, it is front and center, it will allow policymakers to fully consider this. This element is also another proof that plastic pollution is a concern for all countries. Microplastics are everywhere, and clearly landlocked countries like mine, my own, we are also not immune to this phenomenon. And as also just published in recent articles, microplastics has also not only been found as snow in the oceans, but also been found in the mountains, in the rivers, and in the lakes, like in Switzerland. There I will mention the La Clément later today. This resolution adopted at Geneva is also clear on the fact that we will need to use the best available science to guide our actions, and that there will be a need for scientific assessments. No later than last week, a widely shared Guardian article reported about the study that found that 80% of the persons that were tested had microplastics in their blood. This is also another strong indication that we have to act on plastics, and that we have to act on plastics in all its compartments and throughout the life cycles, not only focusing on marine pollution. It is clear the impact of microplastics in the environment and on human health still needs to be further analyzed. The same goes for ways and means to address the issues and avoid leakages of microplastics. But this brings me to the importance of strengthening the science policy nexus. During initial conversation among negotiators, it was clear that we need more data and science, notably on microplastics. Indeed, it will certainly be a horizontal issue during the plastic pollution treaty negotiations, as it is most likely an issue of concern in all the stages of the plastic throughout its life cycle. It is also no surprise that the Nordic Council will deal with this issue for its fifth report to be published after the end of this year. I am sure we will hear more on this issue from our Norwegian colleagues today. Links between microplastics and chemicals will also need to further research, and during the panel we will hear more on that from the BRS Secretary. The need to strengthen the science policy nexus is again very important. I am therefore particularly pleased that today we will hear from Professor Vera Slavekoya on her current research on microplastics. Her work will certainly support our negotiation going forward, and it is a great example of putting theory into practice. Let me now conclude by looking at the synergies that Geneva can offer and the competence that Geneva can offer on this topic. By saying that we are impressed that has happened so far and that all the expertise that we are here in Geneva, we also say that it is great to continue to support the process in Geneva. It is great also to see the engagement from academic institutions to support the policy work, and we are convinced that this will be very much needed also in the further negotiations of the treaty. It is really a privilege to kickstart the third series of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues with such distinguished speakers. This multi-stakeholder approach will allow us to learn from different perspectives and allow us to foster synergies. And I firmly believe that through these kind of partnerships and collective works, that through this we will build a strong coalition to really address plastic pollution. This year we have a number of key milestones along the way to advance our work. The current regional forum on sustainable development, Stockholm +50, the BRS COP, the Ocean Conference. Our colleagues from Portugal will give us more informal later, and the HLPF, to just name a few. But there are also some key steps this year with regard to the new plastic treaty that has to be negotiated. So we will have end of May, early June, the first open working group that comes together in Dakar to plan the further negotiation process of the legally binding instrument plastic. And already this year, we will probably have the first negotiation committee meeting to address and to negotiate the new treaty. These new treaty negotiations will be critical to successfully develop a framework that really will make a difference on the ground. Therefore, we have to work hard together to develop a robust treaty that is effective and efficient and that really will contain the measures needed to address plastic pollution through all the life cycle of plastics, and that will also be critical to help us to achieve the objective of SDG 14.1. Therefore, we have to do everything possible to support these negotiations, and Geneva, once again, with all its expertise, will be a critical place to do so. We stand ready to do our part, notably through experience that we have in Geneva, and I would like to thank all of you for your attention, and most importantly, thank again the University of Geneva and Gen for launching that plastic pollution dialogue series again, and to provide like that also a first input to the HLPF later this year. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for providing the context for our event today. Moving on with the program, as you mentioned, Professor Vera Slavejkova from the University of Geneva will now provide a scientific perspective on life below water and microplastic pollution. Vera Slavejkova is a professor in environmental biogeochemistry and ecotoxicology at the Department for Environmental and Aquatic Sciences at the Institute for Environmental Science of the University of Geneva, and is also the president of the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Vera, you will update us on the scientific advancements concerning the possible effects and risks by microplastics to the aquatic life and biodiversity, based on your current research on microplastics, but also on the global scientific community advancement on this topic. And Professor, you will also speak on the major sources of microplastics and their relative contribution to the global microplastic budget. You will provide us with your latest data on human health implications also. We will also be happy to hear how the work you and the scientific community is doing can be used in political instances and thus can support the negotiations going forward, as it was mentioned by His Excellency Ambassador Perez. Professor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here and very grateful to be able to share with you, the latest scientific advances and provide to you my environmental chemistry and ecotoxicology perspective concerning the issues of microplastic pollutions. So look around you. The microplastic and plastic objects are everywhere. Next slide, please. And we cannot imagine our life without plastics. Of course, we have exponential growing production and use of the plastics object, and concomitantly we have an increase of the plastic objects in our environment, starting from the waste and microscopic objects going towards nano plastics. With all this, there is a rising concerns about the environmental implications of plastic waste in general and micro and nanoplastics specifically. And 5 trillions of this huge number represent the microplastic species that we estimate to have currently in the ocean. Next slide, please. And where this object can come. First, we have what we call the primary microplastics that really found and intentionally produced in different everyday products, for example, toothpaste, creams, and other. They have also a huge use in different kinds of industry as we use them as noodles. Another very big, more than 35% contributor to the global pollution by microplastics is what are microfibers, which are washed out by the clothes that we wear. And you know, maybe you are aware, maybe not, but every time when we wash an item, we know that there is about 1,900 fibers in a micro-sized range that goes out. And then we have a very big group of what we call the secondary microplastics that is produced by the fragmentation of the big objects from plastic waste through the different kind of processes like UV light, the waves of the ocean and aquatic systems, also through different biological processes. And talking about the secondary microplastic, we can see that this intimate link between the microplastic pollution and the macroplastic waste. Next slide, please. And indeed, we know that rivers that are carrying the plastic waste are contributing to more than 90% of the plastic that goes to the ocean. And the top 10 you can see here on the slide, and top one, you know, it's a Yangtze River. Next slide, please. So where are these microplastic found? We know they can be found in the deepest part of the ocean, on the top of the mountains, also in the Arctic ice or Antarctic ice, etc. But here you can see them. They are so globally distributed, but what's very important from my perspective is to know if we have hotspots where the concentration of the microplastic is high. And here on these maps showing the distribution of the microplastics with different sizes range is, you can see that we have two kinds of hotspots. One kind is coastal areas, and the second one are ocean gears. So we know the microplastics are everywhere. Now the big question is there any, and what is the possible impact to the life? Next slide, please. So what we know, first we know actually that the microplastic are taken up by biota in general, and marine biota. So they are ingested by different organisms such as zooplankton species, such as filter feeders. Why? Because the microplastic has a similar size as a phytoplankton, which is the food for all these organisms. Of course, one part of the microplastics will be excreted, but not all. So next, please. So we know that ingested microplastic can be transported through the aquatic food webs. And not only this, we have a data that they show that microplastic can contaminate different tissues and organs when accumulated in the organisms. And here you have an example with the fish that we found that the microplastics are really distributed in the gut, in the liver, and also in the gills of the fish. Next, please. So talking about the effects. So there is this accumulation, but it's very important to know if we have some consequences, some toxicity of this object towards aquatic organisms. And in the literature, we can find a plethora of possible effects. You can find here some examples, including physical effects, reproduction effects, oxidative stress, etc. And this observations were found for different organisms, starting from algae that are at the bottom of the food web, so going, you know, to the fish, also mollusks, etc. And we can say we know two main groups of effect currently. Please, next. So first is the physical effects related with the microparticle size. Could be an inhibition of the food assimilation, decrease of the nutritional value of the food, etc. But more importantly, we worry about the chemical effects of microplastics because we know now that they can act as a platforms for chemical cocktails. And we know that there is different additives that can be released under some conditions that due to their small size and higher activity, the microplastics can absorb different hydrophobic contaminants found in the aquatic environment, as well as toxic metals, as well as pathogen. So there is a big uncertainty with the information that we have available currently, and we know that we have a very complex toxicological profile we observed with the microplastics. But please keep always in mind when we talk about the effect that the doses make, you know, the poison. So all is question of concentrations. Please, next. Next slide, please. So I just choose to give you one example and to show you, you know, it's a really a good example of the chemical effects. A lot of substances can be leached, you know, from the microplastics. And here the colleagues from Switzerland compared the composition of the leaching from different kinds of materials, which was very, very rich in different kinds of substances, including metals, plasticizer, etc. And they were toxic, for example, even to the organisms at the bottom of the food web that we usually do not consider very affected by the microplastics. And please, when we have a discussion, next please, we should keep in mind that when we talk about the microplastic and plastic in general, we're using about 10,000 substances to produce them. They can have different roles. And a very recent study has shown that maybe 2,400 from these substances could be of concern. Next, please. Now, we know we have plastics in the environment. We know they can induce a risk. But as I mentioned, always question also of concentration. So we currently have no tools that allow us to, you know, to do the direct measurement, direct comparison. But what we can do is the probabilistic risk assessment of the effects. And you can see the results that were done for marine system, in which we can see and compare the concentration and their distribution that are measured in the marine environment with the concentration of the plastic that there is no effect induced to biota. And this distribution are very well distinct. That means that under the current situation, we can say that the risk is unlikely. But in the hotspots, in particular, we have this overlap in the distribution. That means the risk is not to be excluded. There is a big uncertainty, and we should work in this direction more. Why? Because when we compare the sets of data available about the exposure and data set about toxicity results, we can see that we have a big difference in the materials that are found in the environment with respect to what were tested for in the toxicity test, and the same concerning the size and the shapes. And also a big issue currently is that we do not have data about the microplastic concentrations with the size below 300 microns. Next slide, please. Now, what about transfer of the microplastics from seafood to humans? Very recent study has estimated that annually, by consuming different seafood, we can be ingesting about 55,000 particles. Of course, you can see here over the globe, the distribution, it is not the same everywhere. In some countries like European, for example, region, or China, Australia, North America, we have higher concentration. That depends of our, food habits, etc. Please. So we are exposed to microplastic, and this is one of the exposure road. Please, next slide. And the major question that we ask, and we have not yet answered, is do microplastic can have an effect to the human health? As was already mentioned, we know that you can find them in the excretion, babies and human and adults. But very, very recently, maybe 2 weeks ago, we have this paper that was published, as was mentioned by Ambassador Peretz, that in 80% of the donors, the high concentration of the plastic microparticles was found. And it's interesting to see that more than 50% were contained the polyethylene terephthalate, 30 were polystyrene, and then the other they were polyethylene. So for me, this is not means, that it could, have some effect, but it's a clear suggestion that the microplastic can pass, the biological barrier and can travel around the body. So we really should keep going and studying deeper. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, the question of microplastic pollution is not just, a question and problem of our ocean. It is all a problem of the terrestrial ecosystem. And I want to give you, an example with Lake Geneva. We're here in Geneva, at the shore of the lake. Geneva Lake, maybe just to mention, is one of the most studied lakes in the world. So it was also one of the first lakes in the world that the estimation of the number of the microplastics was made, and you can see here the number. In the Great Lake, we had about 220,000 of microparticles per square kilometers. Next, please. And what we also found by laboratory research in my group was that this material can be, for example, ingested by different biota. You can see here the example of water flare Daphne magna. We have an ingestion that depends on the size of the particles. Of course, it is dose dependence. And if we do, the ecotoxicity estimation with this species, we can evaluate that depending on the size, the material that we have tested, and it is polystyrene, could be either toxic or harmful according to European hazard classification. Next, please. Now, what we can do, as a scientist, as people working at the university, to support all the efforts, here it's what's logical. With this Sustainable Development Goal number 14, we must reduce the plastic pollution. Of course, we cannot remove, the microplastic from our oceans with the currently existing technology. So, from my perspective, and I'm talking environmental chemistry and ecotoxicology, what we need is to produce, the best possible science that will help to reduce the existing uncertainty, so that we have a low uncertainty when we ask a question if there is any risk or not to the aquatic environment. And of course, to do so, I've seen that we need to develop the methodology that allows to go sample and measure with the bigger precision and as low as possible sizes of this material, and then use them for monitoring, and in the future, use them for monitor the future, treaty of the global level, and also developing concepts and models that also can be used to assess the possible risk and impacts. And of course, I think it's very important from our side, to contribute to the education and to raise the awareness about the plastic pollution, and in particularly the invisible plastic pollution, which is the microplastics and nanoplastics. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Taking stock of what you have presented, we will continue the discussion with the scientific needs of policy and governance. We have three new speakers who will help us unpacking how can this knowledge support global policy and governance, including the UN Ocean Conference, a new instrument on plastic pollution that has been mentioned, achieving SDG 14, and the Chemicals Convention's agenda. We'll discuss also how the existing instruments and multilateral environmental agreements are currently helping to address microplastic pollution. Our first panelist in this part of the program is Heidi Savelli Soderberg. Heidi is with us from Nairobi, where she coordinates the UN Environment Programme's marine litter activities within the framework of the Global Partnership on Marine Litter, which is hosted by the Global Programme of Action for the Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities. Heidi is also an ecotoxicologist, and her work in the past years has been instrumental in supporting the United Nations Environment Assembly resolutions to address the issue of plastic pollution. Heidi, you are bringing here the United Nations Environment Programme context, and among the topics you will be covering, there is the United Nations Environment Assembly resolution, or should I say resolutions, that His Excellency Franz Perez referred to, and how microplastics are addressed in the resolution. You will also speak about microplastics in the Pollution to Solution report that UNEP has recently released, another relevant work on microplastics ongoing in the context of UNEP. And if you have time, you might also add a few words on how UNEP is contributing to the high-level political forum process on SDG 14. With that, Heidi, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for inviting me to be part of this discussion and panel. And as you mentioned already, there has been, of course, a lot of work that's happened over the year, and I think the previous speakers provided an excellent overview of the issues that particularly surround microplastics. If we look at the discussion around the latest resolution, there's of course reference to product design that's included, that amongst areas of provisions that the INC, or Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, may wish to consider. And here, when we're looking at both the intentionally added microplastics that are added to sometimes cosmetics, but many other types of products, this would be an area that could be relevant for consideration and further discussions. It also speaks to the issue of health, both environmental and human health. These are other areas where especially the issue of nanoplastics, and which is a subcomponent or sub-part of microplastics, would also be relevant to consider, again, also in the context of abrasion. So microplastics from wear and tear, both smaller particles and down to nano potentially. So these are some areas for the resolution. And as we're going forward with the ad hoc open-ended experts group, as the ambassador mentioned, it will be taking place 30th of May until the 1st of June in Dakar, Senegal. And this meeting will particularly focus on rules of procedures as well as organization of work, among some things, and will guide or provide guidance to the first INC, which is anticipated to be held later this year. In addition, when we look at the issues around microplastics, UNEP published the From Pollution to Solution report, which was launched in October last year. And this one highlighted the concerns around the monitoring and assessment of microplastics. This was one area. This is of course because of the high variability in size, in shape, in color, degree of degradation, and the fact that there are considerable sampling biases of different field and laboratory techniques for identifying and determining the volume of microplastics in different compartments, including in biota. And that without significant improvements in quality assurance and control protocols for sampling and analytical techniques, it will still remain difficult to demonstrate the reliability and the repeatability of published results that we're seeing around. So that the report highlighted the need of trying to address the issue that data and information are being collected, but quite unconnected and fragmented. and that there is a need to streamline both methodologies, data flows, and also indicator sets. Are we measuring the same type of microplastics, for example, or sizes, or are we using the same language? Are studies comparable across the scientific community? And that there's also need to facilitate increasingly joint analysis, unified definitions, standards and formats, as well as infrastructure and well-developed ones for data flow storage and sharing of information around microplastics to allow us to consolidate and build the body of knowledge that then policymakers can benefit from. And this includes standardization, harmonization, and interoperability of different data sets and platforms. When we're looking at some of the future research priorities that were highlighted in this report, they did look at the establishment of informatics and harmonization monitoring frameworks, standard methodologies, but also look at the potential toxicology of microplastics and additives in different compartments, including in the environment, to be able to measure the effectiveness and impacts of different interventions and mitigation efforts. And also, when we're looking at microplastics, the difference in the range of sizes and also different types of microplastics makes it a more complex issue to try and manage, because there will be different management approaches depending on the type of microplastics that one is trying to address, if it's microfibers, micro nanoplastics, or others like secondary microplastics. I think the professor spoke before me, excellent presentation, and covered everything around the more detailed considerations around microplastics. I will not go into this, but I build on what she said, because she highlighted the need for more risk-based approaches and considerations of risk when we are looking at management. The report highlights the need for risk frameworks, so looking at both a systematic and holistic risk framework to assess the risks that the different microplastics and also plastic pollution pose to ecosystems and biodiversity economies, as well as human health and society. And here there is an opportunity, and we are working with the GESAMP group, for example, the joint group of experts on scientific aspects of marine environmental protection, that have initiated considerations around the microplastics and risk framework as well. And we think when we speak about risk, we don't always think about the risk, finite risk, that is also part of the problem, and that when, in particular with microplastics, could there be liability-related aspects around microplastics in the future? These are things that insurance companies maybe wish to consider as well, as they look ahead about on unwrapping the risk that plastic pollution can mean to both themselves, the insurance industries, but also potentially to investors, where we're looking at especially intentionally added microplastics. So these are some of the things I wanted to highlight, and I'll hand back to Diana. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Heidi. And moving on the agenda on this topic on how can the scientific knowledge support global policy and governance, it's now my pleasure to turn to Nuno Lacasta, President of the Portuguese Environment Agency, who is with us from Lisbon. And it's now the first time. It's not the first time you speak at one of our events. You are a lawyer who previously worked for the Center for International Environmental Law, who is one of the partners of these dialogues. Nuno Lacasta, you will bring us the context of the UN Ocean Conference that Portugal is co-hosting with Kenya this year, and also other processes where Portugal is involved, including, we should mention here that Portugal is chairing not only the group of friends on ending plastic pollution in Nairobi, but also is the current chair, actually, of the United Nations Environment Programme Committee of Permanent Representatives. Nuno Lacasta, over to you.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation, and indeed I'm very much sorry not being able to be in Geneva with you, because as you mentioned, I worked for CL for a couple of years way back when, and I lived in Geneva, so I miss Geneva for sure, and I bet it's getting pretty this time of year. So once again, thanks for the invite, and after a couple of pandemic-related postponements, I'm happy to recall everybody that the much-awaited second United Nations Oceans Conference will finally take place in Lisbon from the 27th of June through the 1st of July this year. So today I'm providing an update on the conference. I think it's relevant for our discussions today. So first, on the preparatory process of the conference. It includes negotiation on a political declaration to be adopted by consensus, a declaration which is concise, action-oriented, focusing on solutions based on science and innovation to support the implementation of the SDG 14 methods, as we mentioned today. Co-facilitators, Grenada and Denmark, presented a draft in February, and this declaration is currently under negotiation at the UN in New York. Issues that for sure will emerge as part of the declaration include topics such as solutions of decisions based on science as mentioned, climate ocean nexus, blue economy, a complete water cycle, banning pollution from plastic waste and litter, of course, and crucially the issue of negotiations on the international treaty mentioned earlier. I think it's a very relevant initiative going forward, but also initiatives related to the establishment of good management of marine areas. These are some of the topics, of course, which, as you know, are being considered. Moving on to the preparation of the eight interactive dialogues as part of the conference, they will address topics that were decided at the preparatory meeting held in February 2020, and were based on a proposal presented by the Secretary General of the United Nations and in line with SDG 14 targets. The UN Under Secretary General Liu Jimin, as you know, was appointed as Conference Secretary General and has invited member states to submit comments or the concept papers for these interactive dialogues. These papers should be finalized by the end of the month of April. Also, after a call for member states to express the interest of their government's high-level representatives to serve as co-chairs, the selection process for such co-chairs is now underway. Two for each dialogue, along the selection of moderators, one per dialogue, and of course members of the panels, four per each dialogue. So this is important that we have a diverse makeup for these panels that is composed both of political representatives and officials and of course experts. Some of the topics which will be part of these dialogues include managing, protecting, conserving and restoring marine and coastal ecosystems, minimizing and addressing ocean acidification, making fisheries sustainable, promoting and strengthening sustainable ocean-based economies, in particular, of course, small island development and least developed countries, and increasing scientific knowledge and developing research capacity, managing microplastics, etc., etc. This is very important because as part of the dialogue on addressing marine pollution, we all know that there is now widespread consensus, as we've heard, that the ocean cannot absorb the current of human waste, and the problem of marine litter is not a myth, as we all know, and everybody needs to be involved. Both countries producing the vast amounts which we just heard, and of course those that happen to be the destination for such litter. In the case of Portugal, as you may know, we have a very extensive exclusive economic zone which stretches far out into the mid-Atlantic, and this, of course, as you can imagine, is a challenge. Another topic I would like to address, of course, is that the event will also have a high-level segment from the 27th of June, as well as several plenary sessions dedicated to statements by the heads of delegation, including heads of state and government. Conference will involve all stakeholders in the implementation of SDG 14, bringing together governments, the UN system, intergovernmental organizations, international financial institutions, and other international organizations organizations, but also academia, scientific community, the private sector, philanthropic organizations, and other actors. This is a very diverse makeup, which we all must take advantage of and profit from their input in order to move forward on looking at how to protect our oceans. The conference priorities are, of course, to achieve tangible results by the involvement of all these stakeholders, and particularly the private and the public sector, but also the financial sectors. Mobilizing youth is also very important, and crucially, looking for the coordination and cooperation between various international initiatives in the area of the sea, which, as you well know, are increasingly working together, such as back in 2017, the first conference on the ocean, now the UN Decade on Ocean Science and Sustainable Development, the World Ocean Assessment 2, published last year, the conferences Our Ocean, an expo taking place in Palau this year, and the One Ocean Summit, among others. Another note I'd like to make very quickly is that the UN Secretary General sent letters of invitation for the conference for all heads of state and government, encouraging countries to participate at the highest political level. This is important, of course, because there is the expectation that the conference, the Ocean Conference, will become a landmark event in terms of sustainable development for this year. And it will feed onto processes and onto also high-level discussions both at the COP15 Biodiversity Convention, COP27, and climate change conventions. And this is important that we have these different processes communicating with one another. It should also be noted that the Conference Secretary General sent a letter as well to member states and international donors, as well as to the private sector, financial institutions and other potential donors, encouraging voluntary contributions to a trust fund to support the participation of representatives of developing countries. And priority here has been given, of course, to least developed countries and small island developing countries. Portugal, for instance, has recently contributed 200,000 euros to this trust fund to encourage such participation. I would also like to very briefly mention that the program, in addition to the official program, there's a host, very diverse number of events being organized, both at official and indeed in the so-called blue zone. And these include a high-level symposium on water, as I mentioned, to address the water cycle, Sustainable Blue Economy Investment Forum, United Nations Ocean Conference on Youth and Innovation, etc., etc. And indeed, it's important that these events take place, these so-called side events take place, but also other side events are included. Therefore, the enrollment for such side events is already launched. Link online is already available. And please note that the deadline for submission of side events proposals is this week, the 8th of April. So this is with regard to the Oceans Conference. We're of course very excited to host it. Later, of course, than we all anticipated, and everything is pretty much on schedule to a very meaningful and interesting conference. Final note, as you mentioned, on a discussion panel that both Portugal and Chile have launched a year back. And it's, as you mentioned, a group of friends on Nairobi to combat microplastic pollution. Indeed, in July last year, Portugal and Chile launched this informal group with the goal of driving an ambitious, coherent, effective global action against plastic pollution in the lead up to UNA 5.2, including, among others, galvanizing support for the development and consideration of an effective global governance framework for litter and plastic pollution. I think this is very urgent, and it's an area which we are very much committed to indeed driving this awareness. And in the face of the landmark adoption of the resolution to end plastic pollution towards an international legally binding instrument by UNEA 5.2. The objectives of the group have been revised to reflect the developments mentioned and in support of the process that is now starting. Therefore, the group will continue the technical and policy dialogues series in Nairobi, and indeed in other relevant and formal activities, in a complementary manner and in support to the work to be developed in the framework of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, to continue creating capacities, improve knowledge sharing. The Nairobi Group of Friends is, as I mentioned, an informal, voluntary, non-legally binding, inclusive, and open-ended association of all interested member states. And currently we have 39 member states, plus the delegation of the European Union, which have officially joined the group, and we continue encouraging member states to officially join the group. And in addition, we also have 22 non-governmental organizations and 1 international organization as part of the group. Since the group's establishment, we've organized several Nairobi dialogue series that have addressed issues such as trade, plastic pollution and circularity, chemicals and health, legal aspects of the potential intergovernmental negotiating committee, and global circular economy for plastics with perspectives from the plastic sector, and more recently, following the adoption of the resolution at UNEA, a meeting of just transition, focusing on the informal waste sector, whose important role is recognized in the said resolution. So this is in a nutshell what I'd like to address this meeting, and indeed inviting you all to attend the UN conference, either in presence or online. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acosta. So we expect to have an upcoming session of the Group of Friends in Nairobi also addressing the issue of microplastics. And regarding the UN Ocean Conference, you mentioned a few processes to which it's linked, but there are many other processes ongoing in Geneva that have also important contributions to make to that conference. We are now moving and bringing the context of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, one of the existing instruments currently helping to address microplastic pollution. Just decreased here with us in the room is a program officer within the Secretariat of the Convention, and he will present the Basel Convention plastic waste amendments and how the Basel Convention can help address microplastics across its 3 pillars. Also to mention that our colleagues is currently ongoing in Nairobi, and many of our colleagues are there, the Open and Working Group of the Basel Convention, with many events ongoing in Kenya. Just, you will also refer to the technical guidelines on plastic waste, technical assistance and other tools to reduce releases of microplastics, and also refer to recent developments under the Stockholm Convention to address microplastics pollution. We'll also hear from you on the chemicals and plastic governance project that the Secretariat has recently launched. With that, just over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and I would like to also express my gratitude to be on such a distinguished panel. It's a real pleasure to once again share my insights in the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue Series. It's always been very, very exciting discussions, I think, and I hope that some of the thoughts I can provide today might be helpful. And of course, considering recent developments, I hope that they can also be helpful as we move forward towards an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. So with that, as already mentioned by Diana, I would like to look at how and try to explore with all of you together how the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, in particular the Basel and Stockholm Conventions, can make a contribution and in fact are already making a contribution to address microplastics. Now, normally we talk about plastic waste in that context, but of course, as we have just heard, the 2 issues are inextricably linked. So a very good example for the science policy interface is how the Basel plastic waste amendments that were adopted in 2019 actually came to be, because no doubt it was the mounting scientific evidence that provided the impetus for governments to come together and adopt the Basel Convention plastic waste amendments. So why do the Basel plastic waste amendments matter for microplastics? I think one way to think about it is we can conceptualize it across 3 pillars, which you see now on the screen also. So first, the amendments imply that all plastic waste, including mixtures of plastic waste generated by parties to the convention and which are to be moved to another party, are subject to the prior informed consent procedure, unless they are non-hazardous and destined for recycling in an environmentally sound manner and almost free from contamination and other types of waste. So the conditions are quite strict, so to speak, to fall outside of this scope. So making the link to microplastics, of course, if we have more control of transboundary movements, if we have less plastic waste being traded illegally, it also means we will have less plastic waste that is not managed in an environmentally sound manner. We will have less plastic waste that is dumped. And as a consequence, we have heard about secondary microplastics being a very important source. So as a consequence, we will have less fragmentation of plastic waste into secondary microplastics. So that's the first. Of course, before I move to the second pillar, so to speak, I would also like to mention when it comes to trade and transboundary movements, that of course also the Stockholm Convention is extremely important. Now, we have already heard in the excellent briefing before regarding the scientific aspects that microplastics of course carry hazardous chemicals. And many of these chemicals are in fact also classified as persistent organic pollutants and listed under the Stockholm Convention. In fact, half of the chemicals that are listed under the Stockholm Convention approximately are also used as chemical additives in plastics. A very, very interesting case that is very recent and again really underlines the science policy interface that is at the heart of this issue is when in 2021, the POPROC, the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee of the Stockholm Convention, decided that UV328, which is also used as a high-volume additive in various plastic products, satisfies all of the criteria noted in Annex D of the Stockholm Convention, including the potential for long-range environmental transport. So essentially it was found that this chemical is being transported with marine debris in long range through the environment. In 2022, the POPROC decided that this chemical is therefore likely, as a result of its long-range environmental transport, to lead to significant adverse human health and or environmental effects, such that global action is warranted. To a lesser extent, but also very relevant, is the Rotterdam Convention, because also this applies to trade, though trade in chemicals, not trade in waste. But also here the prior informed consent procedure, as well as the information exchange mechanisms that apply to the listed chemicals, can be a very helpful tool in addressing chemicals that end up in plastic products and thus eventually also in plastic waste. Turning to the second pillar, by which I mean environmentally sound management. The categories, the specified categories in the plastic waste amendments are also subject to the Basel Convention's provision on environmentally sound management. So here again, of course, a similar logic applies in that if we manage plastic waste that is not already primary microplastics in an environmentally sound manner, then of course we can also significantly reduce the amounts of plastic, the amounts of microplastics that end up in the oceans or elsewhere. And of course, under the Basel Convention, we have a lot of guidance and tools for this purpose. So for example, there are the technical guidelines on the environmentally sound management of plastic waste, which are at the disposal of parties to the convention as well as other stakeholders. And these are currently being updated, and we hope that this process can be completed soon to provide further assistance to parties. And just to briefly also mention that I made the link with the Stockholm Convention, and indeed also in the second pillar on the environmentally sound management, the Stockholm Convention again is of course very relevant because there's also a lot of waste that is contaminated with POPs, right? And on that occasion, I would also just like to mention the project that is currently being implemented by the Secretariat together with the University of Wollongong and with the generous financial support of Norway, which will map the global governance landscape of management of chemicals of concern used in plastic. and it will also outline options how a global plastic agreement could address such chemicals. Turning to the third pillar, prevention and minimization. Of course, the specified categories under the plastic waste amendments also pertain to the specific provisions on waste prevention and minimization. So in that sense, this is also very relevant. And of course, we can make the argument that if we look at the waste hierarchy, could I have the next slide, please? If we look at the waste hierarchy, it becomes very apparent that the most preferable option of addressing any type of waste is always prevention and minimization. This is also noted, in fact, in the strategic framework for the implementation of the Basel Convention, which features the waste hierarchy among its guiding principles. And essentially what it says is that if prevention and minimization is not possible, the next best option is reuse. And then going further down the hierarchy, we come to recycling, and then eventually recovery operations, including energy recovery, and then finally final disposal as the least preferred option. Now, microplastics present very unique challenges. We've heard that during the initial presentation on the scientific aspects, because we have the primary microplastics, we have the secondary microplastics. Then we also need to consider that we have the issue of microplastics being in products. We also have the issue of microplastics being generated during processes, for example, during recycling operations, in the textile sector, and in other contexts. Nonetheless, or perhaps actually because of this, I think the waste hierarchy is even more important, because again, it provides the most efficient and the most direct way of reducing releases to the environment of whatever type of microplastics. Now, this might sound a bit abstract so far, so let me provide a few concrete examples of how we are doing this in many of our technical assistance and other projects, supported by generous contributions from our donors, including Norway, Germany, Switzerland, the Norwegian Retailers Environment Fund, Netherlands, and others. So, for example, if we look at prevention and minimization, the first step of the waste hierarchy, we are currently implementing a pilot project in Ghana where we are trying to use compostable packaging that is made from seaweed in order to replace water sachets, which normally are made from plastics and which pose a huge pollution issue in Ghana due to their widespread use. Another example is the introduction of reusable bags that we are also piloting there, and that many, many other stakeholders are piloting across the world. In fact, we were just gifted one of these beautiful bags. Then when we move further down, recycling. Also here, again, the issue with primary and secondary has to be kept in mind. So for example, we have a project where we, with our partners, collected and then recycled plastic waste fishing nets. So again, these fishing nets, they're often dumped in the ocean, and then of course at a certain point they start fragmenting, leading to microplastics. So again, if we can actually collect and recycle them instead, then we will avoid the microplastics being in the ocean. Another example, and now this is attacking more the primary microplastics, is that we're working with partners to replace microbeads from being used in cosmetics, for example, or toothpaste. Then as we move further down the hierarchy, let's think, for example, about recycling. There we have a little pilot where we're working with the recycling sector to provide training to them, because a lot can be done at very low cost to minimize the releases of microplastics from recycling operations, in particular in developing countries. And to mention another example, we are now planning a pilot in Sri Lanka, again with the kind support of Norway, where among others we are planning to work with the textile industry, because as we have heard, it's a major source of microplastics. So this is just to give some very concrete examples of the many, many options that we actually have to address microplastics at each of these stages that we have seen, from prevention all the way to final disposal. And one final word of an intervention that's also very important, because I mentioned the three pillars: environmentally sound management, prevention, and trade. Regarding trade, of course, we're also providing a lot of technical assistance and trainings, in particular of custom officers, custom authorities, so that they are able to control plastic waste trade efficiently. So to conclude, building on the scientific consensus that we urgently need to address primary and secondary microplastics, as well as the hazardous substances carried by them, and keeping in mind the waste hierarchy, my belief is that we need instruments at 3 levels: preventing microplastics from being generated in the first place, ensuring the environmentally sound management of plastic waste so that we don't have the fragmentation, and controlling transboundary movements of plastic waste, again, to avoid the releases of plastic leading to further degradation. At the same time, we need to address the chemical dimension, such as by phasing out the use of certain hazardous chemicals. And in different ways and in a complementary manner, I believe that all 3 conventions, the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions, can make very important contributions in addressing microplastics across these dimensions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, for this presentation that has completed this part on what's happening on the global policy level with some of the ongoing processes. We have now time for some questions, and I'm looking first at the room for who is physically with us at the International Environment House before I turn to who is online. So for who is online, don't hesitate to use the chat box or the Q&A box. Looking at the room, are there any questions regarding what Vera has presented, showing what the science is telling us about the need to act on these microplastics and what the policy makers have been sharing with us with some of the processes ongoing? I have here a question in the room. Please go ahead and introduce yourself when you take the floor, and don't, open the mic.
Thank you, Diana. I'm Alexander Jose, University of Geneva. Wanted to thank you very much for a very comprehensive layout of the landscape when it comes to microplastic pollution. This event is taking place in Geneva on the sidelines of the Regional Forum on Sustainability and the Forum's Forum of Mayors. And one of the elements that have been discussed extensively during these few last days is data. Obviously, we need, in terms of all sorts of pollutions, contextualize different sorts of pollutions, including microplastic. The question I have for you, Vera, is what kind of data are available at this point, and how far can be contextualized in terms of refining or disaggregating existing data to be able to come up with sound policies?
So maybe before giving you the floor, just checking if there are any other questions to complement. I see, Franz, that you have put on your camera. Do you want to add something, or should Vera first answer? The complexity of hybrid events.
Exactly. No, I just wanted to turn off the camera to show I'm here, but only if that creation. I don't have to say something for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Franz. So Vera, the first question for you.
Okay. Thank you. I would say we have quite a lot and quite some data. A lot of work and advancement was done in the last, maybe I would say 15 years, both on, let's say, assessment of the concentration of the microplastic in the environment, and also the impact and effect of different biota. So that's a nice, but as I mentioned, it's how to say, somehow when we look at the data that are available about the concentrations, they are with some limitations. Then when we look at the data that are concerning the impact, also they are not very consistent with what we found in the environment. And the reason for this is really the lack of tools that allow us to go and really measure in our environment the materials that are in the range below 300 micrometers. That's one point, and that's very important because the material with the lowest size is considered to be more reactive than material with bigger size, and consequently we could expect, that the interactions are more important and consequently also the effects. So I would say there is quite a lot. There is frames. I mean, like for example, this probabilistic risk assessment that's currently available. there is a discussion, and I like very much that we are going in this direction, is to consider the biogeochemical cycles at the global level concerning, you know, how to say, the flow of all this material in all the environmental compartments. I mean, as we do, by the way, for different kinds of contaminants which are covered either by Minamata Convention or Stockholm, etc. So we are on a good way, but we need to go further.
Thank you, Vera. I don't see a hand. Oh, yes, there's a hand here. There are two hands in the room, so please introduce yourself while taking the floor. Yeah. No, the mic needs. Can you check the other mic? There on the right. Yes, thank you.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Harman-Mumford. I'm Head of Oceans and Natural Resources at the Commonwealth Secretariat, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to have just such an excellent summary of the work that's been going on microplastics and its relevance to the new convention. I was fascinated by hearing about the work in Ghana. I think there's a number of these stories coming up using seaweed. We've got a session at UNCTAD this afternoon on seaweed and value chains. So the question I have about that is, what evidence is there that these plastic alternatives are displacing plastics in the market rather than just supplementing it? And what policies should we be putting in place to encourage that displacement?
Just go ahead.
Thank you very much. An excellent question, because it's exactly the kind of question that we try to answer with this pilot. So what we are trying to explore, in fact, is so the introduction of the compostable seaweed packaging will be accompanied by a number of surveys that we will implement throughout the pilot, both with the vendors that are actually going to use this packaging, as well as with the customers who are then going to buy the products that are packaged in this way, so as to find out if there's actually a take-up from both the customers as well as the vendors, because of course we need both sides to be fully on board, so to speak. What we've seen so far is that there is a small but not negligible competitive disadvantage for these compostable seaweed packaging compared to traditional thin plastic that they use, for example, for the water sachets that I mentioned earlier. And we've already been discussing on this, and one of the most obvious, answering the second part of your question, one of the most obvious ways this could be addressed is, for example, through a tax that would apply to plastic packaging. In fact, some countries have taken steps, either already implemented or are taking steps towards such taxes on plastic products. So by raising thus the prices of plastic products, the alternatives may become more competitive over time. So this is our hope, and indeed we hope to learn more about these things. And just a final note to make sure that because when we talk about these alternatives, it's very, very important to be careful, because as we all know, there's a number of alternatives that are deemed or labeled biodegradable, but in fact are only biodegradable under circumstances such as above 60 degrees in industrial composters, etc., etc. So, and they often contaminate the waste stream, recycling becomes more difficult, etc. So these kind of alternatives, we need to be very, very cautious and really have the evidence. Again, science policy, first have the evidence before moving forward with such, for example, oxo-degradable is a good example of where not too steep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Just. There was another question there, Yves Lador.
Yeah, thank you, Lador from the Justice. As the issue is between the nexus between science and policy, we are a bit at a turning point right now, considering the fact that we have also the other resolution that was adopted at UNEA on having a global policy science and policy interface on the question of chemicals and pollution. And I was wondering, in this period where we're going forward, how does this precisely dialogue will continue between the scientific bodies? You have a number of scientific bodies within the VRS conventions. They're also with the Minamata. in a way, they're very expertise approach in the sense that they're very focused. And what we hear also from your presentation, Professor Slavekova, sorry about my very poor pronunciation, you have some kind of a general, you have some kind of wider issue than just the expertise, which is mobilized by the different legal bodies which are focusing on very specific elements. This is precisely the advantage of what we hope to see is coming, this new instruments. But these new instruments will not be there during the negotiation of the instruments, the other legally binding instruments on plastic. And so I was wondering, how do you see these two elements? And this question goes to the scientific bodies as well as to the political bodies. How you see this articulation during this process of the negotiation, as the two are going to be developed in parallel.
Should I start by giving the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Franz Perez? Also because there was another remark in the chat, Franz, on the science and policy and the resolution that was recently adopted at the UN Environment Assembly.
Thanks a lot, Jan, and also thanks Eve for this question. I think that's a pertinent question. As you said, this SPP, this Science Policy Panel that will be developed now and established, will not replace the very specific scientific institutions within the conventions. These scientific bodies within the convention have very specific mandates, for example, to look whether certain substances will meet the criteria of the Rotterdam Convention or whether they meet the criteria of the Stockholm Convention. So they have very specific mandates, and they will, of course, continue to have to deliver that work. The SPP, the Science Policy Panel that will be established now, will have other functions. First of all, horizon scanning, so helping us to detect early whether, if you look at the scientific literature, whether you look at science, whether there is something, there is an issue, a topic that is not yet on our radar, but that should be on our radar, and that will require policy development. So this will be one of the tasks, and the other, of course, also to look at very specific questions that are asked or posed to him. And so in future, this panel could be certainly also supportive for the work as we are doing it now to negotiate the new legally binding instrument on plastics. Sorry. But however, the work of this panel will not be able, the panel will not be able to deliver its results within 3 months, for example. So despite that, we will still need to have the possibility that, for example, we is developing very specific analysis of very specific questions that have to be solved in order to develop the legally binding instrument. If you look at the mandate that was adopted in Nairobi, there are several elements which should be addressed by the legally binding instrument. And in order to find out what are the right and the best tools to address these elements, be it product design, be it sustainable production or consumption, or be it the waste management or life cycle approaches, there UNEP probably will have to undertake very specific studies to support the negotiations. In short, this new science policy panel will not replace neither the very specific mandates of the bodies established under conventions, nor will it be able to deliver the very specific input that will be needed for ongoing negotiations like the one on the plastic agreement. But it will certainly be helpful in order to be in future earlier ready to detect new emerging issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Franz, for this complete answer. Looking here, looking online, and looking also at the time, because we only have a few minutes left, and we also have some closing remarks to hear. I think I can now turn over to all the members of the panel, and I will start with Vera. For if you had a message you would like us to bring back from this home, from this event, Vera, what would be in 30 seconds, 1 minute, what you would like us to take over?
Okay, I will try to be short at this time. So what I would say, the ocean is essential for component of the Earth ecosystem, and it is life supporting. We depend on the ocean for many of our needs. So it's a critical for sustainable development of our planet. So I mean, when we for example, pollute our oceans with microplastics, plastics, or any other substances, From my perspective, that means that we make them ill, we make them sick. So what would be my message? All of us, I mean, science, policy, governments, citizens, etc. What we need to do is really to put all the efforts together and find the best possible solution to treat the causes and not just the symptoms that we usually have this, way of thinking. So find a way to treat the causes and not just the symptoms. That's my final message.
Thank you, Vera. Moving to Heidi, who has to chair another meeting. Heidi, if you are not chairing the other meeting, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And some considerations at the end here, I think, is that the complexity again that we are looking at. Are these things also? What is the definition? There is still not a good enough definition of what microplastics are. Are microplastics also considered? Are they solids or are they not solids? There could also be considerations around class-based approaches as well, and also defining what could be, if we look at essential use around the intentionally added microplastics or primary ones, then you could consider also what is unnecessary, avoidable, and problematic, and how would prior informed consent in a way operate in the context of intentionally added. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Moving to Nuno Lacasta in Lisbon.
Well, first of all, it was a very informative debate here and briefing, and I think the two key takeouts are, number one, that we need informed and science-based policy making. We have lessons from other regimes that was indeed the case. They were successful as a result. Secondly, we have now a public awareness window, as it were, that we must not waste going forward, because the public are indeed demanding from authorities that we address issues of plastic pollution, particularly also microplastics. So I hope the Lisbon Ocean Conference is yet another moment where we're able to come together and move forward on these matters. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lacasta. Moving to Just.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the science is clear that we need to address primary and secondary microplastics as well as hazardous chemicals carried by them. And in doing so, I think it is critical that we keep in mind the waste hierarchy. What that means is, first, that we need to tackle the issue at source by reducing the use of primary microplastics and hazardous chemicals. Second, ensure that plastic waste is managed in an environmentally sound manner to reduce releases of secondary microplastics and hazardous substances. And third, to promote the exchange of information and control of trade in chemicals and transboundary movements of plastic waste. And I think the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions can provide important tools in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Just. And before moving to Norway, who will deliver concluding remarks, Frans, your takeaway message.
Thanks a lot. I have three takeaway messages. The first is saying, like Nuno Lacasta was saying, I think science remains key in all this work. Science is instrumental not only to understand the problem, but also to develop the right solutions. Secondly, I think it has also become very clear, plastic is a comprehensive topic which cannot be addressed in isolation or in a silo. So also the work of the Legal Binding Instrument has really to build on the expertise and make use of the expertise and of the competences of existing actors and institutions, such as the BRS Convention, and certainly not try to compete this expertise, but complement it and work in harmony with that existing expertise. And thirdly, I think what is also absolutely clear, in order to address that big challenge, this needs strong engagement by all of us. A mandate to negotiate the legal binding instrument is not sufficient. We also need a strong and hard work by the negotiators and the political will and support for a robust outcome. But this political will is not something that is given or something that is missing, that is also something that can be influenced and that has to be influenced. And therefore, we need again the strong science, and that brings me back to the first point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And now it's the time to conclude the event, and it's our pleasure to turn to Yannick Gratrud, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Norway to the United Nations in Geneva, to provide the closing remarks of this event. And Norway has been instrumental in making the international community moving on what we have achieved a few weeks ago at the UN Environmental Assembly, and is still very committed on this topic. It has been a real pleasure to collaborate with Norway throughout our journey. Over to you, Excellency.
Thank you so much. And first, thank you, Anna and Jan, and to Geneva University and to Switzerland for organizing this very timely initiative, and also thank you to the presenters for your excellent presentations this afternoon. And I have personally learned a lot, and I've been inspired to see that although there are gaps in the science still, what we do know is that we know more than enough to act, and that it's important to act. Now, already in 2016, UNEP identified microplastics as an issue of growing concern that needs global attention. And as we've heard at UNEA 5.2 this March, the world agreed that the most effective solution to address plastic pollution is an international legal binding instrument on plastic pollution, and that microplastics is a part of plastic pollution. As we also heard, microplastics can be found everywhere, on the top of the highest mountains, and in the Arctic sea ice we also find it. Research tells us that microplastics can be spread with the ocean currents and also by air as long-range pollutants. These small particles are persistent and stay in the environment for a very long time. And given the small size of the microplastic particles, prevention is key, as we've also heard earlier today. In 2016, the Norwegian Environment Agency did the first mapping of microplastics in Norway and proposed suggested means and measures to address this. And this assessment was updated in 2020 as our knowledge and our knowledge of impacts have grown significantly in the last few years. Now, microplastics may be released from a vast range of different items, but they're also part of a global value chain, and we need global measures to address it. And we also have heard, and as we know, the persistence, the sources, and the composition challenge how we regulate the microplastics. Microplastics must be addressed across the entire life cycle of plastics to prevent discharge into the environment. But the science is clear, as we've heard today. The science is clear, and stronger global commitment on microplastic is needed. Now, Norway, we believe that the new global instrument on plastic pollution must include measures targeting microplastics. And supported by the other Nordic countries, we have commissioned a Nordic report on how to address microplastics in a new global agreement. This report will be written by the Norwegian Institute for Water Research and will be ready by the end of this year. The aim is to inform the discussions to take place in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. And together with Rwanda, Norway has launched a high ambition coalition to ensure that we keep up the ambition for the new instrument on plastic pollution. Through this initiative, we will seek to build a broad-based coalition with members spanning all regions of the world. And the focus will be to deliver key messages before the INC meetings to drive ambition into the process, as well as to work intersessionally at all the technical levels to develop knowledge products and facilitate discussions in key areas to inform decision-making. Now, I thank you all for the very encouraging discussion today, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue as we move towards a new global instrument to end plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gratrud. And indeed, it's now time, it's really closing this event. Thank you all our panelists, and we look forward to bring you all back in further dialogues, looking at other aspects of this when we are building this new plastic ending plastic pollution agreement, and also you, Vera, in the work that will be done in Geneva concerning the science policy platform that we'll be setting up. So looking forward also to have most of you coming back on these particular topics. Thank you all the attendees who have been online, those who have courageous come here to the Environment House. It's a pleasure to see people again in person. Bring to attention that there is an important session coming up also tomorrow that is taking place not here at the Environment House but at the Graduate Institute, where we will also be discussing the way forward this new ending plastic pollution agreement with a lot of interesting speakers, and Switzerland is also on board. And this week, the Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its new report, and we will be back again here in this same room at the International Environment House discussing the findings of this report. So for those of you who are also interested on those topics, please join us either in person, either online for that event. Bring to attention, we received some requests online concerning sharing of publications and documents. There are a lot of